Well, good morning everybody and welcome to this, our 5th Relate Institute annual lecture. It's wonderful to see you here, and it's wonderful to have, on my right, Tanya, Byron and Deidre Sanders. The format for today is that Tanya will be chairing. I'm just going to introduce, and I'll say a word or two at the end. I'm Nick Tarsh, I chair Relate, and it's a great privilege to chair Relate. And we're delighted to be able to tell you this morning that Relate has a new patron, one of our patrons, in Tanya Byron. Tanya, thank you very much for agreeing to be a patron of ours. I'm sure you all know about Tanya, so I'm not going to tell you of the very long CV and the wonderful work that she does. But we're all delighted to welcome Tanya as a patron of Relate. To get proceedings underway, I'm now going to hand over to Tanya, who will take us from here. All yours.
Thank you, Nick. I don't feel grown up enough to be a patron of Relate. You know, there are some things in life you think I'm not grown up enough. I don't feel grown up enough, but thank you for asking me. For those of you who are interested in my CV, just to let you know that my mother is actually here today, so she'll be available to talk to you afterwards. She can tell you everything you want to know from my birth onwards. So she's here, her name is Elfie. Also my daughter Lily is here, so if you want to know what kind of rubbish parent I am, she'll be able to tell you. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here. The Relate lecture is renowned. There have been many important lectures, many important statements made within these lectures, and today I'm particularly pleased and privileged to be chairing the lecture given by Deidre Sanders. Before I do, I've just got to do some housekeeping. I've never done this before in my life, and I'm so looking forward to it. Okay, so there are no fire drills planned. If a bell goes off, it means there's a fire. Which, even if Deirdre's riveting, which I know you will be, I do think we ought to leave, but you can carry on outside. So leave the building by the nearest exit, and make your way to the assembly point, which is the UCL main quadrangle along Gower Street. And it also says here, please be aware there is a street with lots of traffic, because it would be really ironic if you run over as you were fleeing the fire. You're not supposed to use the lifts, you're not supposed to collect personal belongings, la 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 la. But could I also say, unless you are a surgeon on call, can you please switch off your mobile phones, because that would be a disaster if they went off. Particularly if your ringtone is the Muppet Show like mine is. Right. I want to talk about Deidre Sanders, who doesn't need an introduction, and the reason I feel particularly privileged to be introducing you, Deidre, is because as someone who writes a column around issues to do with mental health, families, parenting, and general adult mental health issues, and have been for the last 7 years for the Times, I feel I am really sitting next to the trailblazer, the woman who I believe has set the whole notion of public-facing discussions around issues to do with relationships, to do with sex, to do with families in motion. Deirdre has been writing her page for the Times since 1980. For the Sun, yeah, I'm the Times. Do you know why? Because we're both really anxious people are going to throw tomatoes at us, because we both wrote... Anyway, moving swiftly on. Yes, you've been right for the Sun, Deirdre, for 30 years, and you've answered over 6 million letters. You have a team, but I know that you are very actively in charge of the team and the tone of the letters. It's really important to know that none of the letters are made up, and that's because they don't need to, because so many people write to Deirdre, because you are so respected in terms of what you say and how you help people, I think about some often very complicated issues in ways that are very straightforward and no nonsense. Deirdre is also a founder member of Kids in the Middle Coalition and has written lots of parenting guides, lots of guides for parents and children. You were also a member of the social work task force that was set up by the previous government, and I know that you're advising the current government as well. There's more. Deirdre is also the patron of the National Association of People Abused in Childhood, and you have been invited and have been a member of the NSPC Commission of the inquiry into the prevention of child abuse. And I think, again, it's important just to say, from my point of view as a practitioner, someone who works in the NHS, that I know that a lot of people that I see feel able to come and see people like me because of the work that you do in terms of making these issues open and destigmatising the fact that people can talk about them and come and receive help for them. There's a lot more to say about Deidre, but I'm not going to say it because I think we really want to hear what you have to say. So please will you join me in welcoming Deidre Sanders. Thank you.
Hello everybody, and it's certainly an honour to have been asked to deliver the Relate Institute lecture this year, but the political backdrop is considerably different from when Claire and Lady Tyler invited me around 3 months ago. So I actually want to start with what could otherwise be the elephant in the room. What's it been like working for News International for all these years? All the talk this last week or two has been as if our newspapers are just composed of proprietors, executives, and dog's body journalists. Yet to me and most of my colleagues, our paper and website are a dialogue with our readers. The readers are a major part of the paper, a live part of the discussion, and they're not just a mass out there that we dump headlines on every day. As far as I know, I'm the last newspaper agony aunt left with an answering service. It shows our respect for the readers, it costs News International a lot of money, and Rebecca Brooks and the other editors of The Sun have been great supporters of the problem page. Every genuine problem letter and email sent to me receives a personal reply. I'm fantastically proud of that service and have replied to well over, as Tanya said, over 6 million readers in the 30 years I've been agony aunt at The Sun. And someone thought it was an estimated figure, but actually I'll tell you, we count them in and we count them out. So that is everything properly added up. It's because we provide that answering service that so many hundreds of readers write to me every week, and of course my job does give me direct insight into what's actually going on in millions of homes around the country, stuff they may not be telling their doctor, are hiding from their employer, social worker, children's school or even counsellor. I quite regularly hear from readers telling me they're seeing a therapist or psychiatrist, but they're not telling them about the voices in their head. It's sometimes very scary. But from the reader's point of view, the great thing about an agony aunt like me is that telling me all about it feels private. I'm not official. They'll never have to see me face to face. The power rests with them. They can totally ignore what I suggest without any awkwardness, and I've no axe to grind as their mum or best mate might have. With The Sun selling more than 3 million copies a day and read by 1 in 4 adults in the country as copies get passed around, the range of our readers is amazing. And my guess is it's much more culturally diverse than I think many realise. You see, people often seem to assume that The Sun's read by a white van man and his missus, but our readership mirrors the population of the country astonishingly closely. 87%, both of the UK population and of Sun readers, are of white background. But these days we have roughly 1 million readers of non-white ethnic origin, and in fact people with an African background, and I discovered this when I was actually trying to get their figures for this speech. People with an African background are slightly more likely to be Sun readers than those with a white background. So when replying to emails and letters, we've learned we need to be very aware culturally. We have to think twice, for example, about suggesting a teenager boost their confidence with the opposite sex by developing a wider mixed social life if their name is Hussein or Balbinder. Yet diverse though our readership is, there is a real family feel. I've often got into a taxi, that's in the days when journalists' expenses ran to a taxi. The driver would recognise me within literally 2 sets of traffic lights. We'd be deep into his relationship or family problems. I was once heavily pregnant and in for some sort of check-up. I'd been rigged up, well, you chaps won't know, but the women will. I'd been rigged up in one of those dreadful cotton type at the back things which leave your bum hanging out, and was trapped in a tiny stuffy cubicle. A nurse came in, drew the curtain and whispered loudly, "I've just heard of an old boyfriend who wants me to meet up with him. Do you think I should? Should I tell my husband?" I talked about The Sun's dialogue with our readers, and my conversation with them is pretty intense. My column appears in The Sun 6 days a week. There's a full page every day and a spread on Saturdays. Online, I reply to a teen worry every day, run a forced pen pal service, answer a problem from another part of the globe every week in Dear Deirdre Worldwide, plus cover a sex therapy subject, and there's a daily episode of Deirdre's photo casebook, both in the paper and online every day. and that's scripted and directed by a brilliant colleague, Laura Collins, but based on a reader's problem. There are also 6 different telephone helplines every day, and I run a texting service on Saturdays. We try to reply to the hundreds of problems sent in every week within the week. Emails we mainly reply to within the day, in fact. And it does all add up to a huge amount of human suffering. Becoming an agony aunt is actually very scary. As Susie will know, Susie Hayman, who's just joined us up there, you can't help but think, who am I to try to tell anyone, let alone so many, how they should sort their life out? Well, of course, I don't go round bossily poking my nose into other people's lives. They write to me. And it makes a huge practical and psychological difference to me that I'm not alone. I have the support of a brilliant team of 8, some of whom are here today, 6 of whom have counselling training, much of it with Relate, and including one who's a Relate counsellor, sex therapist and schools counsellor. Some we just keep on writing for months as we work through a complicated and stressful problem with them. And if someone sounds very down, perhaps suicidal, or has a really serious problem such as domestic violence, we write to them again off our own bat after a couple of weeks or a month to ask how they are. Of course, we'll say, you know, I hope you don't feel that we're intruding, but I've just been worried about you. Did you get the help you need? And if a child is at risk, we keep on writing till we know that the case has been reported to the NSPCC or someone else appropriate. So when people say to me, as they often do, those letters aren't real, are they? You make them up. I grind my teeth. My difficulty in selecting the dilemmas to go in my column is that I'm spoiled for choice. I think it's an amazing privilege that so many people have trusted me with their very personal problems. And these days, I actually hear from readers we've helped over generations. Dispatches from the family frontline indeed. A grandfather wrote to me at the end of last year saying, I wrote to you 28 years ago when my wife and I were having problems. Your advice got us talking again, and we went on to have a family of 4 lovely girls. Later, one of them had difficulty starting a family, and you sent her your leaflet, want to have a baby, which certainly worked because she's got a smashing little boy now. It's my niece needs your help this time. Her teenage daughter is worrying her sick, staying out late, drinking, skipping school. Can you work your magic again? Looking back over those 30 years of agony columns, some themes remain sadly unchanged. I'd already had a bit of experience of being an agony aunt when I joined The Sun, and in the introductory interview the paper ran about me, which was at the end of October 1980, I talked about young people whose sex lives get ahead of their emotional maturity, girls telling me they had a baby so they'd received the love they never felt at home with their own parents, couples regretting divorce, not having foreseen the pain, loneliness and separation from their children that would result. Well, very sadly, those are all problems that are as common in my mail now as they were then. But there have been some very positive changes. When I started 30 years ago, homophobic attitudes were widespread. I was trying to make my column a welcoming space and feel safe for them. And a 40-year-old gay man actually thanked me the other day for being his one ray of hope when he was a teenager in a strongly Catholic family and feeling very isolated. Nowadays, he's out, MPs are out, government ministers are out, men and women, reflecting a far more understanding and tolerant society than 30 years ago. Another major change over the past 30 years, which I see as being ultimately positive, is that we now have a far greater understanding of the prevalence of child abuse, especially sexual abuse, and its aftermath. It's hard to realise now because we take it so for granted, but when I started at The Sun, almost none of the general public, and even few professionals, realised just how widespread a problem this is, or the long-term effect on lives and relationships. My own eyes were first opened when in the early 80s I wrote 2 books based on surveys of 10,000 women and 5,000 men and their experiences of love and sex. I included questions on sexual harassment and abuse almost as an afterthought, and was shocked at the responses. Around 1 in 10 had been victims, which back then seemed absolutely astounding. When in the mid-80s I was invited to be a member of the NSPCC Commission of Inquiry to Prevention of Child Abuse, as well as talking to paediatricians and social workers and so on, I suggested we reach out to readers through my column. More than 1,000 who'd suffered abuse as a child wrote in long, heartfelt, heart-rending letters of ruined childhoods and wrecked relationships. And these, the NSPCC's Childhood Matters report, and the personal energy of the now CEO, Peter Saunders, led to the setting up of NAPAC, that's the National Association of People Abused in Childhood, of which I was a founder member, and as Tanya said, I'm a proud patron. As well as the help now available to survivors, which I know makes a huge difference, simply for them to know that they're not the only one and they're not to blame, such a key message. And there's been a similar evolution in our attitudes towards survivors of rape. My peace of mind as an agony often relies on being able to refer readers on for support or more specialist guidance to groups such as NAPAC or Rape Crisis. And I found that in my very first column for The Sun, which was November the 3rd, 1980, I suggested a reader go for what was then called marriage guidance counselling. I've got to say also in an early column was a letter from a husband who discovered his wife cuddling in the park with a milkman. How many of us even have a milkman now? But all the way through those 30 years, I doubt more than a week has gone by without me referring a reader to relate in my column. And in our private emails and letters, we're suggesting relate counselling to hundreds of readers every week. And these days, I'm a huge fan of the free online support for parents, now offered via the Relate for Parents website, just brilliant. I've also seen an important shift in attitudes over these 3 decades towards counselling. It was almost a dirty word when I started. Readers would say, don't tell me to go for counselling, as if it would brand them as faulty or a failure. But nowadays, it's seen as a pretty normal route to go if you've got relationship problems. And I like to think that the drip, drip, drip of referring to Relate so often in my column has helped break down some barriers. And certainly I do get feedback from many organisations that I mentioned in my column triggers a boost in taking of their service. In fact, such is the effect that we actually always pre-warn organisations we're about to mention them, because otherwise they can find that their helpline is completely overwhelmed or occasionally their website crashes. One of the positive changes I've seen over these 3 decades is a massive development in the acceptance of what a central part relationships play in our lives and how important it is to get them right. Not having a good relationship is now seen as a shortcoming, where once it might have been dismissed as irrelevant to a successful life. It's far more widely accepted now that relationships should be meaningful, equal, respectful, satisfying, and safe. I used to hear from women who seemed to accept that being the victim of violence was something they just had to put up with. Now they know it's wrong, but they may feel trapped. A woman said the other day, he calls me names and hits me, but says he'll kill himself if I leave him. But, and this is a big change, also nowadays, I'm very likely to hear from men admitting they've been violent, but bitterly regretting it and wanting to change. One guy said, I made a big mistake and I thumped my girlfriend when we were both drunk. I don't want to be that sort of guy. I'm not saying the problem has gone away, it hasn't. Women's Aid supports up to 250,000 women and children every year, but there has been an important shift. And men are much more likely now to write to me about relationship problems in general than they were 30 years ago. In part, this is because of the advent of email. Men are much more comfortable emailing than they ever seem to be writing letters. But in the early days, men seemed to write almost exclusively because they couldn't find a girlfriend, or once they had got a partner, because they were suffering from sexual problems. We used to comment ruefully how many men seem, I'm sorry guys, but we did used to comment how many men seemed to write to say, we were happily married until I came home to find a note on the kitchen table to say she'd left me. In other words, lots must have been going wrong, but he hadn't noticed. Nowadays, men still write a lot about their lack of confidence in finding a partner and about their sexual problems, and more on that later. But also because they're conscious that their relationship is in decline, even if they can't quite put their finger on why, and they want to know what they can do about it. One the other day said, I've realised that my wonderful wife and 2 daughters are the most important things in my life, but I've been neglecting them. I know I appear like a selfish pig. But he wanted to change. Another of the major developments I've seen during these 30 years is the numbers and expertise of voluntary and self-help groups has, until this era of recession and organisations, era of recession and spending cuts, grown astonishingly rapidly. I learned just how helpful these and invaluable these self-help organisations can be very early on. It was January 1981, so I'd only been at the Sun a couple of months, that I heard from a teenage mother who said she loved her 7-week-old baby very much, but she couldn't cope. She'd gone out and left her, The baby was crying a lot, wasn't eating much, and seemed very lifeless. She thought the baby must be dying, and the only thing to do was to kill them both now. We'd noted the postmark on her letter, there were no emails in those days, but that was the only clue we had as to her whereabouts. I contacted the NSPCC, who started checking hospital records for the area, and I also alerted a self-help group for parents under stress, that's now part of Family Lives, and gave their number in my column for the girl to ring. We were all very keyed up, wondering what was going to happen. It felt like an extremely long day. But at 5 p.m, she did finally phone the helpline, and they offered to pay her taxi fare to come over to them with the baby. And when she arrived, they won her trust, and she let them take her and the baby to hospital. Staff there said that considering what terrible postnatal depression she was suffering from, she had actually coped remarkably well, and the baby was going to be fine. So that was a happy ending, but what I wasn't prepared for was that that same day, the helpline heard from another 50 parents, citing just as desperate a state as that girl, one who'd admitted they'd nearly strangled their child. So it was a real joy to me when Parentline, the development of that self-help group, got funding for a 24/7 helpline in 1999. I mean, quite apart from my job as the mother of two and now grandmother of two, I know just how long the night can be with an unhappy, disturbed, crying, screaming baby or child, let alone problems such as a partner drunk or out of it on drugs. The sad thing is that we're seeing the clock turn back because of all the financial pressures and cuts. Family Lives, which Parentline Plus evolved into and of which I'm a patron, so admit a vested interest, have been struggling to keep their service 24/7. Others are falling by the wayside. We used to find the PACE helpline invaluable for people with relationship problems linked to gay, bi or trans issues, but it's lost its helpline funding. Where do we send those readers now? It's going to be an increasing problem for agony aunts and uncles over the next few years, not to mention all their readers. Covering complex subjects for so many readers, of course we need to use standardised information on top of personal replies. We have hundreds of leaflets from voluntary and self-help organisations, and over the years I've written around 250 specially tailored leaflets covering common problems from sexual difficulties to tracing lost loved ones. And in case you were interested, I think you'll have found you've got a copy of my leaflet list in your pack, because it's almost in a way, it shows what are the most common problems in the country. We've sent out millions of these leaflets over the years, and they're all available as email attachments, of course. And on the whole, the system works remarkably well, and in fact, we happily hear from many readers saying thank you. Our worst snarl-up was back in 1984. There's a box on my column which tells the readers at which address to write to me had accidentally been omitted. And as it happened, in that week's column, back then it was just weekly, not daily, was a thank you letter from a reader who'd experienced sexual satisfaction for the first time ever in 16 years of marriage, thanks, she said, to the advice she found in my leaflet on an orgasm. She was thrilled, and 10,000 some readers wrote in asking for a copy of the leaflet. Only, of course, there was no box on the column telling them where to write. So they thumbed through the paper until they found an address which happened to be at the office just down the road from our main editorial office, from which they sent out the bingo cards. And they sent their stamp addressed envelopes there. Of course, we didn't know what had happened until a couple of weeks later when I got all these letters in from readers complaining, I sent for your leaflet on orgasm, and you sent me a bingo card. What am I supposed to do with that? In fact, the questions I'm asked about sex have proved to be almost a litmus paper for changes in society over the years. When I started at The Sun, the Height Report on Female Sexuality had been published just 4 years previously. Millions of women all around the world and their partners were waking up to the idea that intercourse was not the be-all and end-all of sex for women, and exploding the myth that there was something called a clitoral orgasm, which was different from and inferior to a vaginal orgasm. During the course of the next couple of decades, maybe, I sent out thousands upon thousands of that leaflet on women and orgasm, but the demand was probably declining as people became more knowledgeable, until a whole new audience showed up in this century. Men and women from cultures which find sex education challenging, and in which a young couple who are almost totally inexperienced, certainly with each other, may marry and be very unsure how to develop the rich sex life they've heard should be theirs. once more now, as back in the 80s, I hear from young men worried that masturbating will make their penis shrink or damage them in some other way. And some of these writing to me online from somewhere east and or south of Istanbul. We really do suggest they seek guidance from their faith leader when appropriate. But as one of my team commented dryly, I sometimes get the feeling we're educating the whole of the Middle East about masturbation. Alongside this new audience of sexual ingenues, though, fresh problems are developing among couples who share the mainstream culture in the UK, and so expect themselves to be sexually knowledgeable certainly by the age of 18, if not 16. When I started this job, I used to hear from girls worried that their first serious boyfriend would realise they were not a virgin. And now I hear from girls worried that he will realise she is. And the boys and the men are under pressure like never before. I've always heard from men worried about erection problems, but they used to be in their 40s or 50s onwards. Now I hear from 18-year-olds. I rarely used to hear from men who'd simply lost the desire for sex. Then around 10 years ago, I had to write a special leaflet for them. And although men have always worried whether they had enough inches where they thought it counted, I used to be able to rely on their partners to be reassuring, especially since penis size isn't a crucial ingredient for good sex. Until this last decade, I'd never been told about a woman openly jeering at a man for being small, and now it's a regular problem, and the guys are so demoralised. Of course, in part this reflects the increase in casual sex where the emphasis tends to be all on performance, instead of sex as the expression of a caring relationship. And that is one of my failed campaigns, which regularly keeps my ego down to a healthy size. Along with many others, I've banged on all these years about what a bad idea it is to have sex with someone you've just met that night. Not because it's morally wrong, but because it's so likely to be risky and bad quality sex, but we're not getting our message across well enough. And when I started this job, I never heard from anyone thinking of trying a threesome or swinging until they were in their 40s and had a chance to get bored with, in quotes, ordinary sex. Now I hear from teenagers thinking it's de rigueur. It would make a huge difference to so many of these problems if we committed to real relationship education in schools. So many people who see themselves as supporting family values get hot under the collar about honest sexual information being given to young people, when all the research suggests that it encourages the young to delay experimentation. Yet it seems incredibly hard to get any government to commit to promoting relationship education, putting the relationship before the sex part, which could make such a difference to the future happiness and stability of the rising generations across all the cultures in this country today. Especially when young people are so exposed to what's been the biggest behaviour and attitude change in all my 30 years as an agony aunt, and that's the internet. I've had to write new leaflets and update like never before just to keep pace. When HIV struck in the early 80s, people used to ask me back then if it had had a massive effect on my postbag, and the answer was no, actually. Especially back then, it was only affecting a comparatively small section of the population. But nowadays, 3/4 of homes are on the internet, and going online is something most of us do every day. It's impossible to get a firm, truthful figure about use of pornography, but studies suggest that 60 to 70% of men probably look at pornography regularly. High numbers of women use pornography too. And more readers are getting into sex texting, sex chat online, and webcamming all sorts of sexual behaviour. But of course we all have different views on what's acceptable erotica, okay tick, and what's hardcore and inadmissible by our standards, cross. But I hear repeatedly from readers, and have talked to sex therapists who find the same, that online pornography has a particularly addictive quality, and use tends to escalate. There's something about sitting there in that familiar space, staring into the screen with your hand manipulating the mouse, and probably yourself. And it's not just lonely people with no love life. I heard from a father recently who spelled it out. He said, I don't know what's wrong with me. I have a beautiful wife, we have a great sex life, 2 lovely kids. But I'm drawn to looking at pornography on the internet and getting turned on by more and more hardcore stuff. The other day I found myself looking at girls I'm sure were underage. I'm disgusted with myself, but seem powerless to stop it. And there is real conflict going in relationships these days about what constitutes cheating online, if anything. Every day I hear from couples, though one or both of them has been getting sexual kicks online using their PC, laptop, iPad or smartphone. Their partner feels hurt and objects, but they insist it's not real cheating. A woman wrote, this was just last week, I found my fiancé was sex texting, chatting and swapping naked pictures with an old girlfriend. I blew my top because as far as I'm concerned that's cheating. He just says he hasn't met with her and he can't see why it upsets me. I know Relate counsellors are finding it an issue for a high proportion of the clients they're seeing. My view is it damages intimacy and drains sexual energy out of a relationship, but there's very little discussion of the issue out in the public arena to help us all set clear guidelines. And young people too are suffering from a mixture of secrecy and confusion around this subject. I hear from young people literally not yet in their teens worried about their addiction to sexual images on the internet. And lots more write into me with problems that are resulting from their having got their ideas of what's normal between a couple from internet pornography. I hear from teenagers being pressured by partners their own age to try bondage and S&M. Yet the emphasis in public discussion has nearly all been about what parents should do or would like done to control their children's internet use. And that's great, but what we also need is help going directly to the young people to empower them, because they know, some of them, that they have a problem with this. And I've written a leaflet for those worried about their own addiction to internet pornography. And in fact, I'm meeting with Children and Families Minister Tim Lawton next week. So I do hope we are going to see some progress in this area, so that there is soon something more general available for young people. And this does reflect a theme I think has been consistent throughout my 30 years as agony aunt of the Sun. Governments often say they're going to put children at the heart of this policy or that policy or all policy. But of course kids don't vote. Time and time again I feel I've seen what was meant to be child-centred slide towards parent-centred or some other centred, where there are votes to be won. And the interests of parents and children don't always coincide. In fact, sometimes they're in serious conflict. As some of you know, Tanya mentioned, I've been closely involved for the last few years with Kids in the Middle. It's a coalition of 30 largely family and counselling charities and 26 agony aunts aiming to support children experiencing conflict in their family. I wrote a guide, Kids in the Middle Guide for separating parents and their children. We enjoyed some early successes with aims like securing an increase in provision of counselling in schools, much of it provided excellently by Relate, of course. But this government has shifted the emphasis in that now it's no longer a requirement that Ofsted consider how well a school protects and promotes its pupils' well-being, and there's no ring-fence funding now to support counselling in schools. In contrast to Wales and Northern Ireland, where it's compulsory, and Scotland, where compulsory provision of counselling in schools is being considered, in England we've taken what I see as a backward step. It's down to individual schools to decide whether to budget for counselling or not. And heads and teachers' understanding of just how vital this work is likely to be varied, especially with all the other undoubted pressures they're facing. I mean, certainly I know that the counsellor on my team who's doing schools counselling for Relate has found that one of the 2 schools she was working for has just discontinued it. Yet early work like this with children and young people is so effective in bringing about the very changes in relationships and strengthening families that politicians of every hue always say they support and that the country needs. We know that emotional damage to children and young people when their parents' relationship is in trouble or non-existent tends to be replayed in self-destructive behaviour, emotional problems and or troubled relationships later on. It becomes a grimly self-perpetuating cycle. And it's an extraordinarily common problem. 1 in 3 of today's under-16s will experience the breakup of their parents' relationship. 1 in 3. It's an issue that affects all of us. I bet all of us here personally know a family where the parents are split up and there have been at least mixed effects on the children. Isn't it frustrating that some parents do their level best to put their own feelings to one side where their children are involved and try to liaise decently over contact and other such arrangements, while other parents, just as well educated maybe, just as well off, use the children as weapons to hurt their former partner in every way they can think of, seemingly oblivious of the children's feelings and the long-term effect on them? How do we get through to them? And what feels like sometimes a heaven-sent relationship with a single parent can seem just to add to the woes of their child. A 16-year-old boy told me recently, since Dad moved in with his new girlfriend, he's no time for me, she's all right, but I haven't had a proper talk with Dad in over a year. The welfare of the children is supposed to be at the heart of the revised system of family justice, and I really hope we see major practical progress. Not only is this problem truly widespread, but for me it's framed by grimly similar tragedies at either end of the 30 years I've been at the Sun. The early 80s when I began were years of depression and high unemployment. The first series I wrote for the Sun in my very first week there was called Families at War, and it was about the effects of unemployment and financial hardship on families and relationships, mainly in the North East. One day we received a cassette tape in the post. It was from a father who'd lost his job, then his home because he hadn't been able to pay the mortgage, and his marriage had broken down. The first day he had his 2 children round his bedsit. He smothered them both, recorded the message to me, posted it, and then went home and shot himself. It broke our hearts to hear that sad, flat voice, and know it was all too late. And then just last month, I heard from a father now in prison, convicted of the murder of one of his children and the attempted murder of the other after a 7-year struggle over residence and contact, which he said drove him to breakdown. Of course that doesn't excuse what he did, and he himself says he deserves to be in prison. But one child is dead, another is traumatised, and you have to feel that we're not serving families well when this is the outcome. It's after days like that that I find it tricky to know how to react when people comment, "Oh, an agony aunt, that must be a bit of a giggle." And I can't help noticing the symmetry over these last 20 years. As I said, I joined the Sun in time of recession when relationships and families are being strained by economic hardship. And we're back there today. I'm hearing, as all my colleagues will be, from more and more families feeling the pinch of spending cuts, price rises and pressures on jobs. Yesterday we ran a special feature in the Sun about hard-up families who are feeling the strain. I've written a Tough Times guide, which is on both the Sun and I believe now Relate's website, aimed at helping couples and families protect their relationships from the strain of hardship. At least now I'm hopeful that these days there is more understanding of the pressures, greater willingness to accept help, and more help around still, please God may it last, thanks in fact to many of the people in this room. So if you have any questions or would like to make any points of your own, I'd love this to open out into a discussion because I know I've still got an awful lot to learn from you. Thank you.